Hey guys, and welcome to this video on function equations. So let's make it happen. Alright, consider the following function, named Paul, and you see that we've got an input-output table already made. Now, perhaps you can already tell what Paul's rule is. In this case, the rule is the output is equal to 6 times the input. Now, perhaps after looking at just the first input-output pair, maybe you thought that the rule was the output equals the input plus 15. But be careful. The rule has to work for all of the input-output pairs. It can't work for just one or just two. For instance, with just this input-output pair, here's a list of 10 different rules that would have worked. So, want to make sure that our rule works with every single input-output pair, and just goes to show how many different types of rules we're going to be working with this year. Alright, going back to our rule, output equals 6 times the input. Now, since our input and output can vary, and it's a little cumbersome to write out the actual word output and the word input every single time we want to talk about this rule, we tend to use variables and equations to represent these functions. So instead of writing output, we would put a variable here. And instead of writing input, we would write a variable there. Now, before we go ahead and do that, here are some tips that I'd like to share with you. Variables not to use. Don't use the letter O. It looks a lot like the number 0. Don't use a capital I or a lowercase l, because each of those look like the number 1. I also wouldn't use a lowercase t, because that looks like a plus sign. And I wouldn't use the letter S, because it looks like a 5. Now, we can use whatever variables we want, but mathematicians have a few variables that they really like to use often. They are x and y, where x represents the input and y represents the output. Now, by convention, if we ever see the variable x in an equation, then that variable most likely represents the input. And if we ever see the variable y in an equation, then that variable most likely represents the output. So, instead of writing output equals 6 times the input, we could just write this as y equals 6 times x. Note, when we're writing multiplication with a number and a variable, there are some ways that will be far less confusing than others. So, the ways that we like to write multiplication with a number and a variable are 6 times x like this, or you can even do 6 multiplied by x like this. Please, please, please refrain from writing something like this, and definitely want to avoid something like this. These two ways of writing multiplication on the bottom are going to be very, very confusing, especially after our next lesson or two. Okay, so we've got our equation written. Y equals 6 times x. Now, we can use any variables we want. But if we use variables other than x and y, we must label our variables as either the input or the output. So for instance, if we wanted to use the variables k and m, we'd first have to write let k equal the input and let m equal the output, and then we could go ahead and rewrite this function's equation as m equals 6 times k.